The 911 dispatchers received 12 frantic calls from the fourth floor of Mercy General, but by the time SWAT breached the doors, the screaming had stopped. They expected to walk into a massacre. Instead, they found a squad of elite mercenaries zip-tied with tourniquets, their eyes wide with a terror that had nothing to do with police sirens. For 2 years, the doctors joked that Nurse Emily Clark had ice water in her veins because she never flinched at a code blue. They thought she was just a shy, overworked nurse with a messy ponytail. They didn't know she had spent 4 years in the 75th Ranger Regiment hunting high-value targets in the mountains of Kandahar. When a cartel hit team stormed the ward to extract a VIP, the commander thought he was taking over a soft target full of civilians. He didn't know he had just locked himself in a cage with a predator in blue scrubs. He came looking for a victim. He found a war. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you, and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now, let's get into the story. It was 0200 hours on a Tuesday. The silence of the ICU was rhythmic, hypnotic. Just the mechanical hum of the HVAC and the steady beep, beep, beep of heart monitors. The air smelled of rubbing alcohol and burnt coffee. Emily Clark walked the corridor with her blue med bag slung over one shoulder, a clipboard clutched to her chest. To the casual observer, she was invisible. She was 32, with blonde hair pulled back in a utilitarian ponytail that had seen better days. She moved silently, her rubber-soled shoes making no sound on the linoleum. She spoke in soft monosyllables. She never argued with the residents. "She's a ghost," Dr. Evans muttered at the nurse's station, barely looking up from his charts. "Does she ever speak or just stare?" Evans was tired and arrogant. He didn't notice things about people like Emily. He didn't notice that she didn't just walk, she glided, rolling her weight from heel to toe to silence her steps. He didn't notice that she always positioned herself facing the exit, or that when a tray dropped in the break room, she didn't jump, she instantly shifted into a combat stance before correcting herself. Emily typed her notes. Patient in 404, stable. Vitals, normal. She wasn't bored. She was scanning. Old habits didn't die. They just waited. 5 years ago, Emily wasn't changing IV bags. She was a ranger attached to a cultural support team, clearing compounds in total darkness. She had traded her rifle for a catheter tray to escape the violence, but the muscle memory never left. Then the rhythm broke. The stairwell door flew open with a violence that shook the walls. It wasn't a gurney wheel squeaking, it was the heavy, aggressive stomp of combat boots. A man in a dark leather jacket burst into the hallway. He raised an AR-15 carbine, the barrel sweeping across the terrified staff. "Get on the ground, now!" he screamed, his voice shattering the sterile calm. Dr. Evans crumbled. The junior nurses dropped to their knees, hands on their heads, sobbing. The gunman, erratic and shouting commands, thought he had total control. Emily froze, but not from fear. While the staff saw a monster, Emily saw data. Target, male, unstable, finger inside the trigger guard, safety off. She turned slowly, clutching her med tray with both hands. She rounded her shoulders, widening her eyes to look like a terrified nurse about to faint. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling perfectly. "Don't shoot." The gunman sneered, swinging the rifle barrel toward her face. He saw a victim in blue scrubs. He didn't see that her grip on the heavy plastic tray had tightened, or that she was already calculating the trajectory needed to drive the sharp corner of the clipboard into his windpipe. The ICU at Mercy General didn't sleep. It only idled. At 0200 hours, the rhythm of the ward was a low-frequency hum composed of whirring ventilators, the rhythmic whoosh of oxygen scrubbers, and the erratic, distant moans of patients coming out of anesthesia. For most of the staff, this was the graveyard shift, a time to endure until the sun came up. For Emily Clark, it was a patrol. She moved down the center of the corridor, her rubber-soled shoes silent against the polished linoleum. Over her right shoulder hung a battered blue equipment bag, the strap worn frayed from years of overuse. In her hands, she carried a plastic medication tray with the reverence of a religious artifact. To anyone watching, she was just checking stock. To Emily, she was inspecting her loadout. Epinephrine, atropine, sedatives. In her previous life, her kit had been filled with flashbangs and tourniquets. Now it was filled with chemical restraints and gauze. The mission had changed, but the mindset hadn't. "You're doing it again," a voice drawled from the nurse's station. Emily paused, shifting her weight imperceptibly to the balls of her feet before turning. Sarah, a 24-year-old grad fresh out of nursing school, was spinning in a chair, phone in hand. "Doing what?" Emily asked, her voice flat, stripped of any inflection that might invite a longer conversation. "Staring into the void," Sarah said, popping a bubble of gum. "You look like you're waiting for the roof to cave in. Relax, Em, it's Tuesday. The only thing happening tonight is Mr. Henderson's kidney stone passing or Dr. Evans yelling about his coffee order." Emily offered a tight, polite smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. "Just checking the rounds, Sarah." "You're so intense," Sarah laughed, turning back to her screen. "My boyfriend asked if the Ice Queen was working tonight. I told him you probably freeze your milk before you put it in your cereal." Emily didn't respond. She turned back to the corridor, her ponytail swaying slightly. She liked the nickname. Ice Queen meant they thought she was cold. Boring meant they stopped paying attention. Being underestimated was the best camouflage she had. She continued her walk, her eyes scanning the environment not for dirt, but for anomalies. She stopped at the end of the hall, near the large bay windows that overlooked the ambulance bay 4 stories down. Rain streaked the glass, distorting the streetlights into blurry halos of orange and white. Emily adjusted the med tray in her hands, her fingers brushing against the cold plastic. She looked down. Most people saw a parking lot. Emily saw a perimeter. A dark delivery van was parked in the loading zone. It had been there when she clocked in at 1900 hours. It was now 02:15. The engine was idling. She could see the faint plume of exhaust vapor rising in the cold night air. No delivery took 5 hours. No driver wasted gas like that unless they needed the heater running, unless they were waiting for a specific signal. Her eyes narrowed. She shifted her gaze to the reflection in the window, looking behind her. The ward was still, but something was off. She walked toward the emergency stairwell door at the far end of the east wing. It was a heavy fire door, designed to remain locked from the outside and closed at all times. As she approached, she saw it, a tiny sliver of darkness between the door and the frame. Emily knelt, fiending a dropped pen. She inspected the latch. A strip of gray gaffer tape had been placed over the strike plate, preventing the bolt from locking. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a janitor being lazy. It was a breach point. Her heart rate didn't spike. It dropped. The familiar cold clarity of the zone washed over her. The noise of the ventilator seemed to fade, replaced by a hyper-awareness of the space around her. The geometry of the hallway sharpened. The nurse's station wasn't a desk, it was hard cover. The IV poles weren't medical equipment, they were spears. The blue bag on her shoulder wasn't just a kit, it was a weapon system. She stood up slowly, peeling the tape off the latch with a fluid motion and pocketing it. She let the heavy door click shut, engaging the lock. "Everything okay, Clark?" Dr. Evans walked out of a patient's room, rubbing his temples. He looked at her with the disdain he reserved for anyone without an MD after their name. "Fine, doctor," Emily said softly. Just a draft. "Well, fix it. I'm freezing," he muttered, brushing past her towards the elevators. Emily watched him go. He was walking into a choke point. She looked back at the stairwell door she had just locked, the van outside, the taped latch, the silence that felt too heavy, too thick. The air pressure in the room seemed to drop, the way it does right before a mortar hits. She gripped the handles of her med tray tighter, her knuckles turning white. She wasn't just a nurse anymore. The switch had been flipped. Then, from the stairwell she had just secured, came a sound that didn't belong in a hospital. It wasn't the squeak of a shoe. It was the distinct metallic clack of a breaching charge being primed against the steel frame. The sound wasn't a knock. It was an implosion. The heavy fire door to the stairwell didn't just open, it bowed inward with a deafening crack before flying back against the wall, vibrating on its hinges. The sterile silence of the ICU shattered instantly, replaced by the sharp smell of ozone and the violent, heavy stomp of boots. Dr. Evans dropped his coffee. The ceramic mug exploded on the floor, brown liquid splashing the pristine white loafers of his scrubs, but he didn't notice. He was paralyzed, his mouth agape, staring at the figure emerging from the stairwell shadows. The man was a collision of worlds. In a hallway of soft blues and antiseptic whites, he was a jagged smear of dark aggression. He wore a heavy black leather jacket that creaked with his movements, dark jeans and tactical boots that left muddy prints on the waxed floor. But it was what he held that sucked the air out of the room. A carbine rifle, matte black, raised and ready. "Get on the ground, now, nobody moves." The voice was raw, shouting over the ringing in everyone's ears. It wasn't the voice of a professional soldier, it was the frantic, adrenaline-spiked scream of a man who enjoyed the fear he was causing. Chaos erupted. Sarah screamed, a high, piercing sound that cut through the ward. She scrambled backward, her chair tipping over, crashing to the floor. "I said down, get on your knees," the gunman roared, swinging the barrel of the rifle in a wide, reckless arc. Dr. Evans collapsed first, his arrogance evaporating instantly. He fell to his knees, hands clasping the back of his head, trembling so violently his ID badge rattled against his chest. Down the hall, 2 orderlies and a visiting husband dropped where they stood, curling into balls against the baseboards, making themselves small, trying to disappear. Emily didn't move. She stood near the med cart, her body turned slightly away from the intruder. While the rest of the staff saw death walking toward them, Emily's mind instantly fractured into 2 distinct streams. One was the terrified nurse, trembling and clutching her medication tray like a shield. The other was Staff Sergeant Clark, and she was running a combat geometry diagnostic in slower than slow motion. Subject: male, 6'2", approx 220 pounds. Weapon: AR-15 platform, short barrel, EOTech holographic sight. Behavior: erratic, elevated heart rate, tunnel vision. "You, Blondie." The gunman took 2 heavy steps toward her, closing the distance to less than 10 feet. "I said drop the tray and get on your knees." Emily turned her head slowly, looking back over her shoulder. This was the moment. The image that would have looked like terror to a security camera was actually a targeting scan. She looked directly at the weapon, her eyes locked onto the receiver. The fire selector switch was flipped to safe. No, wait, he had modified it. It was resting on fire. She traced the line of his arm. His elbows were flared out, not tucked in. Poor form. He was muscling the weapon, not controlling it. Then she looked at his hand. His index finger wasn't resting along the frame of the trigger guard. It was curled tight inside, pad resting on the trigger. Trigger discipline? 0. He was one loud noise away from accidentally discharging a round into the ceiling or her face. The gunman thrust the muzzle forward, the black circle of the barrel filling her vision. "Are you deaf? Kneel."
Behind him, the scene was a tableau of total surrender. The staff were on their knees, heads bowed, weeping. They were sheep waiting for the slaughter. The gunman thought he had total dominance. He thought the woman holding the plastic tray of sedatives was the weakest thing in the room. He didn't notice that Emily's stance was grounded, her feet shoulder-width apart. He didn't see that her grip on the plastic tray had shifted, her fingers locating the heavy, sharp corner of the reinforced bottom. He was looking at her eyes, expecting to see begging. Instead, she saw something flat, something empty. Emily calculated the distance, 6 feet. If she moved now, she could deflect the barrel upward, step into his guard, and drive the tray into his throat before his brain could send the signal to squeeze his finger. It would be messy, it would be loud, but it was a 90% probability of a kill. She tightened her core, the muscles in her legs coiling like springs ready to snap. She took a breath, preparing to launch the tray into his face. But then, the radio clipped to the gunman's chest crackled to life, and a voice, calm, deep, and terrifyingly professional, cut through the static. Echo 1, report. Do you have the floor? The gunman hesitated, his eyes flickering away from Emily for a fraction of a second to reach for his radio. Yeah, Vargas. Floor is secure. I got hostages. Vargas. Emily froze her attack. The name hit her like a physical blow. She knew that name, and if Vargas was here, this wasn't a robbery. It wasn't a random attack. It was an extraction, and the man in front of her was just the pawn. She exhaled, letting her shoulders slump, feigning a breakdown. She needed more intel. She needed to know how many more were coming. Please, she whimpered, allowing her voice to crack perfectly as she slowly lowered herself to one knee, keeping the tray close to her chest. The gunman grinned, satisfied. He lowered the rifle slightly, believing he had broken her. He didn't see Emily slide her hand into the pocket of her scrub top, wrapping her fingers around the glass ampule of succinylcholine she had palmed from the tray. He stepped closer, looming over her, presenting his femoral artery just inches from her face. Stay down, he sneered, turning his head to shout at Dr. Evans. He had just turned his back on the only thing in the hospital dangerous enough to kill him, and Emily realized with a cold, thrilling certainty that he had just made the last mistake of his life.
The gunman's patience was disintegrating faster than his tactical discipline. He grabbed the collar of a terrified first-year intern, a boy named Tim who looked barely old enough to drive, and yanked him off the floor. "I asked a question!" the gunman screamed, jamming the muzzle of the AR-15 into Tim's cheek. The barrel distorted the boy's skin, pushing his head to the side. "Room 404, which one is it?" Tim couldn't speak. He was hyperventilating, his eyes rolling back in his head, his hands clawing uselessly at the gunman's leather jacket. "He doesn't know!" Dr. Evans shrieked from the floor, his face pressed against the tile. "Don't shoot him!" "Shut up!" The gunman racked the charging handle, ejecting a live round that clattered onto the floor, a theatrical display of incompetence that made Emily's teeth grind. He was going to kill the kid by accident. His finger was twitching on the trigger, responding to the spikes of his own adrenaline. Emily didn't think. She didn't calculate. She simply executed Protocol B, de-escalation. "Sir." The word cut through the panic like a scalpel. It wasn't a scream, it wasn't a plea, it was the nurse voice, that specific authoritative tone used to command drunk patients in the ER or soothe delirious CEOs. It was low, firm, and maternal, designed to bypass the aggression centers of the brain and trigger an automatic compliance response. "Look at me," Emily said, rising slowly from her kneeling position. Her hands were visible, palms open, though her left hand still balanced the plastic medication tray. "He's an intern. He started 3 days ago. He doesn't know the room numbers yet. I do." The gunman shoved Tim away. The boy collapsed, gasping for air. The barrel swung toward Emily. You know where the VIP is?" VIP. The confirmation locked into place. Room 404 housed a man admitted under a pseudonym with private security that Emily hadn't seen since shift change. Cartel. This was a retrieval op. "I know where he is," Emily lied smoothly. Room 404 was 3 doors down, clearly marked, but the gunman was disoriented by the layout and the stress. "I have his medication right here. He needs it or he goes into cardiac arrest. You need him alive, right?" The gunman hesitated. The mention of the target dying spooked him. Vargas would kill him if the package expired. "Get up," he growled. "Take me to him. No funny business or I blow your legs off." "I'm coming," Emily said. She took a step forward, allowing a tremor to ripple through her hands. She needed to close the distance, but she was still unarmed. The hallway was too long, and he was keeping 6 feet of separation. She needed a distraction. She needed an edge. She looked down at the medication tray in her hand. It was loaded with glass ampules, epinephrine, furosemide, saline. As she took her second step, she intentionally tripped over her own foot. "Whoa!" she cried out. She didn't try to catch the tray. She threw it downward, adding force to gravity. The plastic tray hit the linoleum with a chaotic clatter, but it was the glass that did the work. Dozens of vials shattered instantly. The sound was explosive in the quiet corridor, a sharp, violent crash that sounded like a gunshot. The gunman flinched, ducking his head and swinging the rifle wildly toward the noise. "What the hell are you doing?" he screamed, stepping back. "I'm sorry, I tripped. I'm sorry," Emily wailed, dropping to her knees instantly amidst the puddle of mixture chemicals and broken glass. "Leave it. Get up. I have to clean it. It's slippery. You'll fall," she babbled, her voice high and frantic. She kept her head down, her hair curtaining her face. Under the cover of her panic, her right hand moved with the precision of a striking cobra. She swept through the debris. She didn't feel the sting as a micro-shard sliced her thumb. She felt only the cold, rigid shape of a jagged piece of the shattered epinephrine ampule. It was 3 inches long, tapered to a razor-sharp point. A primitive shiv. She closed her fist around it, tucking it tight against her palm, and stood up. She held her hands up, the glass hidden against the meat of her thumb. Blood from her small cut trickled down her waist, blending with the spilled medicine, selling the illusion of a clumsy, terrified nurse. "Move," the gunman commanded, gesturing with the rifle barrel toward the patient rooms. "You open the door. You go in first." Emily turned her back to him, her face dropping the mask of terror the moment he couldn't see her. She squeezed the glass shard, testing her grip. He wanted to go into a patient room, a confined space, no witnesses. "Okay," Emily whispered, stepping toward room 404. "I'm opening it." She reached for the handle. The gunman stepped closer, right into her kill zone, eager to secure his prize. He thought he was about to complete his mission. He didn't realize he was walking into a room with the one thing more dangerous than a loaded gun, a medic who knew exactly where to sever the brainstem.
The air in room 404 was heavy with the smell of stale illness and fresh fear. The VIP, a man named Castillo, lay in the bed, groggy and tethered to a cardiac monitor. He wasn't the hardened cartel boss the news painted him as. In a hospital gown, stripped of his entourage, he was just another body failing to keep itself alive. "Get him up," the gunman barked, kicking the brake off a wheelchair in the corner. "Unhook the wires. We're moving." Emily moved with practiced efficiency. She silenced the alarms on the monitor before detaching the leads. Her hands were steady, her face a mask of subservient terror. As she leaned over the bedside table to grab Castillo's chart, her hand brushed the crash cart. In a movement too fast for the gunman's adrenaline-flooded eyes to track, she snatched a pre-filled syringe of succinylcholine, a rapid-onset paralytic used for intubation, and slid it into her sleeve. "Move," the gunman shouted, waving the rifle barrel toward the door. Emily maneuvered the wheelchair into the hallway. The gunman fell in behind her, using her body as a human shield against the empty corridor. They moved toward the service elevator at the far end of the ward, away from the staff huddled on the floor. "Press the button," he commanded, sweat dripping from his nose. He was unraveling. The silence of the hospital was getting to him. Emily hit the call button. She could hear his breathing, ragged, shallow, loud. He was standing too close. Mistake 1. He was checking his watch, taking his eyes off her hands. Mistake 2. The elevator doors slid open with a cheerful ding. The interior was stainless steel, mirrored on 3 sides, a perfect kill box. Emily pushed the wheelchair in, turning it to face the doors. The gunman stepped beside her, jamming the lobby button with his thumb. The doors began to slide shut, sealing them in a steel coffin. "You're doing good, nurse," the gunman muttered, his voice trembling slightly as he lowered the rifle just an inch. "Just get us to the van and you go home." Emily looked at his reflection in the steel doors. "I can't go home," she said softly. He frowned, looking at her reflection. "What?" "My shift isn't over." The change in her voice made him turn. He didn't see the nurse anymore. He saw the predator. Emily stomped on his instep, driving her heel down with enough force to crush the metatarsal bones. The gunman gasped, his mouth opening to scream, but the sound never came. Emily's left hand, holding the shard of glass she had saved from the hallway, slashed upward. She didn't aim for a kill, she aimed for mechanics. The glass sliced across the back of his right hand, severing the tendons controlling his trigger finger. The rifle clattered to the floor as his grip failed. He lunged for her with the good hand, panic turning his eyes wild. Emily didn't retreat. She stepped inside his guard, embracing the violence. She jammed the syringe of succinylcholine into the side of his neck, depressing the plunger in one fluid motion. "Shh," she whispered, her face inches from his. He stumbled back, crashing against the mirrored wall. He reached for his throat, but his arms were already feeling heavy. The drug was a depolarizing neuromuscular blocker. It worked in seconds. His knees buckled. He slid down the wall, his eyes wide, terrified and fully conscious. He tried to shout, to beg, to curse, but his diaphragm was paralyzed. He was a prisoner in his own body. The elevator hummed, descending past the third floor. Emily stood over him. She didn't look like a hero. She looked like a technician finishing a repair. She reached down and unclipped the radio from his tactical vest. She looked at the AR-15 lying on the floor. It was a powerful weapon, a force multiplier, but it was loud. It was clumsy in tight corridors, and if she fired it, every mercenary in the building would know exactly where she was. She kicked the rifle into the corner, behind the paralyzed gunman. "You're going to feel like you can't breathe," Emily told him, her voice clinical, as if explaining a side effect to a patient. "That's because you can't. If your friends don't find you in 4 minutes, you'll asphyxiate. I'd suggest you pray." She hit the emergency stop button between floors. The elevator jolted to a halt. Emily grabbed the hatch release in the ceiling of the elevator car. She hoisted herself up, muscles coiling, and disappeared into the darkness of the shaft, just as the radio in her hand crackled to life. "Echo 2, report," a deep voice demanded. "Vargas. Why has the elevator stopped?" Emily stared at the radio in the darkness, a cold smile touching her lips. The commander was about to realize that the silence in the hospital wasn't empty, it was waiting.
Echo 2, report. The silence on the radio channel was absolute. Commander Vargas stood in the center of the 4th floor nurses' station, his thumb pressing down hard on the transmit button. He didn't yell. Men like Vargas didn't need volume to convey violence. He looked at the elevator indicator light. It was frozen between the 2nd and 3rd floors. "He's gone," Vargas said, his voice cold and dry, like grinding stones. He looked at the remaining 6 men in his squad. "We have a leak. Someone is picking at the seams." He turned to the wall panel that controlled the building's main breakers. He didn't want a fair fight. He wanted a hunt. "Kill the lights. Switch to thermal. Let's see who's hiding in the dark." He pulled the master lever. The hum of the hospital died instantly. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered and died, plunging the world into a heavy, suffocating blackness. A second later, the red emergency track lighting kicked in, bathing the corridors in a bloody, low-voltage gloom that cast long, erratic shadows. 3 floors down, Emily didn't freeze. While the sudden darkness caused the patients in the wards to cry out in confusion, Emily simply closed her eyes for a second, shifting her mental map from visual to tactile. She knew this building. She knew that the floor tiles in the east wing had a slight ridge every 10 feet. She knew the air currents shifted near the elevator banks. She counted her steps. 1, 2, 3. Left turn. She moved through the red darkness like a phantom, her hand brushing the wall for orientation. She could hear them coming, heavy boots thumping against the stairs. 2 of them. They were moving tactically, sweeping the floor, their weapon-mounted flashlights cutting harsh white cones through the gloom. They had night vision. She had memory. Emily slipped into the janitorial closet on the 3rd floor and locked the door silently. It was a cramped space, smelling of industrial lemon and damp mops. She didn't hide behind the shelves. She went to work. She grabbed a gallon jug of industrial-strength bleach from the bottom shelf. With her other hand, she pulled down a bottle of ammonia-based glass cleaner. In a hospital, these were kept strictly separated, stored on different shelves to prevent accidental mixing. Protocol dictated they never touch. Emily was about to rewrite protocol. She could hear the mercenaries outside. Room clear. Moving to the utility closet. Check everything. Vargas says the target is hostile. Emily worked fast. She poured the bleach into a mop bucket, the smell sharp and acrid. Then she uncapped the ammonia. She didn't mix them yet. That would kill her too. Instead, she tied a length of gauze from her pocket around the neck of the ammonia bottle and looped the other end to the inside door handle. She placed the bottle precariously on the edge of the utility sink, directly above the bucket. It was a primitive rig, a physics problem. When the door opened, the gauze would pull, the bottle would tip, and the chemicals would meet. She soaked a face mask in water and pressed it tight over her nose and mouth. Then she climbed up the metal shelving unit, wedging herself into the narrow gap between the top shelf and the ceiling, pulling her knees to her chest. The doorknob rattled. Locked, a voice growled. Kick it. The door exploded inward under the force of a boot. The sudden motion yanked the gauze. The ammonia bottle tipped, falling into the bucket of bleach below. The reaction was instant. A hiss of white vapor erupted from the bucket as the chemicals combined to form chloramine gas. It wasn't just smoke. It was a caustic weapon that turned moisture into hydrochloric acid. The 2 mercenaries stormed in, rifles raised, their night vision goggles illuminating the room in green phosphor. They expected a gunman. They walked into a chemical cloud. Clear lip. The lead mercenary stopped, clawing at his throat. The gas hit his mucous membranes like liquid fire. His eyes burned, blinding him instantly despite his goggles. He gasped for air, but every breath sucked more of the toxic vapor into his lungs, searing the tissue. Gas! Gas! The second man screamed, stumbling back, coughing violently. He tried to raise his rifle, but he was retching, his body betraying him as his airway spasmed shut. From her perch on the top shelf, Emily watched them crumble. They were trained to fight men with guns. They weren't trained to fight the cleaning inventory. As they fell to their knees, wheezing and blinded, Emily dropped from the ceiling behind them. She didn't waste time. She grabbed the first man by his hair and slammed his face into the metal shelf, silencing his wheezing. The second man swung blindly with his rifle butt, but Emily was already low. She swept his legs, sending him crashing into the chemical puddle, then delivered a precise, calculated kick to his temple. The silence returned, broken only by the hissing of the bucket. Emily stepped out of the closet, closing the door on the unconscious men to let the fumes finish the job of keeping them sedated. She stripped the night vision goggles off the second man and pulled them over her own head. The world exploded into crisp green clarity. Now she could see the heat signatures. Now she could see the war. She tapped the earpiece she had stolen from the first gunman. Vargas, she whispered into the mic, her voice distorted by the static. Vargas didn't respond, but Emily heard a new sound echoing down the ventilation shafts, a sound that made her blood run cold. He was shouting orders to execute the hostages in the hallway if she didn't surrender in 10 seconds. She looked down the hall toward the oxygen storage room. The game had just changed. If he wanted to play with air, she would show him what happens when you add pressure to the mix. The radio on Emily's shoulder crackled, the sound harsh and invasive in the silent hallway. You have 10 seconds to surrender. Vargas's voice was calm, which made it terrifying. Or I start culling the herd. 10. Through the green phosphor glow of the stolen night vision goggles, Emily looked down the main corridor. The erratic gunman from the breach, the one who had almost killed the intern, was standing over the hostages, They were huddled against the wall, a shivering mass of blue scrubs and white coats. The gunman had his rifle raised, the laser sight dancing on Dr. Evans's forehead. 9. Emily wasn't in position to shoot, and even if she were, she didn't have a gun. She was 50 feet away, hidden in the alcove of the respiratory therapy storage closet. She looked at the racks around her, rows of green steel cylinders. Oxygen. 8. To a civilian, an oxygen tank is life support. To a ranger, a pressurized cylinder containing 2,000 psi of compressed gas is a potential bomb that just needs a detonator. Emily didn't need a fire, she needed physics. She grabbed a heavy E-cylinder tank, the size of a small torso, and dragged it onto a wheeled linen cart. She didn't have time to be gentle. She wedged the cart into the doorway, aiming the top of the tank directly down the center of the hallway, straight at the gunman's position. 7. She reached for the heavy pipe wrench hanging on the emergency maintenance board. Her breathing was steady, a slow rhythm against the panic rising in the corridor. She positioned a wrench over the brass regulator valve at the top of the tank. 6. She needed him to turn. She needed a clear line of fire that wouldn't shred the hostages with shrapnel. The tank wasn't going to explode like a grenade. If she sheared the valve correctly, the escaping gas would turn the steel cylinder into a rocket, accelerating it to highway speeds in a fraction of a second. She keyed the radio mic.
Radiology was the coldest part of the hospital. It was a labyrinth of lead-lined walls and heavy doors designed to contain energies that could see through bone. Emily moved past the X-ray suites and the CT scanners, her eyes fixed on the double doors at the end of the hall marked with yellow and black warning triangles. Zone 4, danger, high magnetic field. She didn't barge in. She knew Vargas was waiting for that. Instead, she slipped into the darkened control room that overlooked the MRI suite through a thick wire mesh reinforced window. Through the glass, she saw them. The MRI suite was spacious, dominated by the massive donut-shaped cylinder of the 3 Tesla scanner. The machine was a sleeping giant, its white plastic shell gleaming in the emergency lights. Vargas stood near the patient table, his weapon raised, using the bulk of the machine as cover. He had 2 men left, hard-eyed mercenaries who looked nervous in the strange, sterile environment. They had dragged the VIP, Castillo, onto the floor behind the scanner. They had cleared the room like soldiers, they had checked the corners, they had covered the doors, but they hadn't read the signs. Emily holstered the heavy 1911 pistol she had taken from the hallway gunman. She wouldn't need bullets for this. She sat in the swivel chair at the control console, the bank of monitors glowing with the machine's standby diagnostics. She leaned forward and pressed the talk button on the intercom. "You picked the wrong room, Vargas." Inside the suite, the 3 men spun around, rifles searching for the source of the voice. Vargas looked up at the control window, spotting her silhouette. He raised his rifle, aiming at the glass. "Bulletproof leaded glass, Commander," Emily said, her voice distorted by the suite speakers. "And RF shielding. You can't shoot me, and your radios won't work in there. You're in a Faraday cage." Vargas lowered his weapon slowly, a sneer curling his lip. "You're trapped, nurse. I have men at the exits. You have a stolen pistol and a dying savior complex. Open the door, and I'll make it quick." "I don't think you understand the terrain," Emily replied, her fingers dancing over the keyboard of the console. She wasn't logging out. She was overriding the safety protocols. "You see, you brought a lot of steel into my house. That rifle, the buckles on your vest, the shrapnel in your VIP's leg. What are you talking about?" Vargas snapped, stepping closer to the machine. "Physics," Emily said calmly. "That machine isn't just a camera, it's a superconducting magnetic. Do you know what 3 Tesla means?"
She didn't wait for an answer. She began toggling the sequence for a high-speed gradient echo scan, the loudest, most vibration-heavy protocol in the system. The Earth's magnetic field is about 0.5 Gauss, Emily lectured, her voice hardening. The magnet you're standing next to is 30,000 Gauss. It's 60,000 times stronger than the gravity holding you to the floor. It's always on, Vargas. It's always hungry. But right now, I'm about to wake it up. Vargas looked at the machine. He looked at the rifle in his hands, 7 pounds of ferromagnetic steel. He felt a strange tug, a ghostly pull on the barrel, like the air itself was thickening. "It's just a magnet," one of the mercenaries muttered, though he gripped his weapon tighter. "It's not a magnet," Emily corrected. "It's a monster." She reached for the dial that controlled the gradient coils. Usually, a technician ramps this up slowly to avoid startling the patient. Emily cranked it to maximum. Then she uncovered the emergency switch, not the quench button that would kill the field, but the spin-up sequence used for calibration. "Drop your weapons," Emily warned, her hand hovering over the execute key. "Drop them now, and you might walk out." Vargas laughed. He raised his rifle again, leveling it at the glass. "I'm going to kill you, you little—" "Lesson over," Emily whispered. She slammed her finger onto the key.
The rifles didn't fall, they flew. The moment the gradient coils screamed to life, the laws of gravity inside the MRI suite were suspended, replaced by the violent, invisible hunger of the 3 Tesla magnet. The air itself seemed to thicken, charged with a force that tasted like ozone and iron. The 2 mercenaries flanking Vargas screamed as their weapons were ripped from their hands. It wasn't a gentle tug, it was a violent extraction. The AR-15s flew across the room like iron filings to a magnet, slamming into the bore of the scanner with a sickening crack that fractured the plastic casing. One mercenary, too slow to let go of his tactical sling, was dragged across the linoleum. He slammed chest first into the machine, pinned there by his own vest and the weapon strapped to his chest. He flailed, pinned like a butterfly on a corkboard, screaming as the steel plates in his armor crushed his ribs against the scanner housing. Vargas was smarter. He had released his weapon the moment the pull started, but he wasn't safe. The steel buckles on his boots, the knife on his belt, the spare magazines, everything was pulling him toward the white donut of the machine. He roared, ripping at the Velcro of his tactical vest, shedding the heavy armor just as it yanked him off balance. The vest flew off, joining the tangled sculpture of weaponry stuck to the scanner. Emily didn't watch from the safety of the window. She moved. She dropped the steel 1911 pistol on the control desk, taking it inside would be suicide, and kicked open the heavy door to the suite. The noise inside was physical. The machine was screaming, a rhythmic mechanical pounding, thump, 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 that vibrated in her teeth. Vargas was recovering. He stood near the patient table, stripped of his armor, breathing hard. He saw Emily enter, unarmed, small, blue-scrubbed. "You bitch!" he screamed, the sound barely audible over the machine. He charged. Vargas was 6'4" and built like a tank. Emily was 5'7" and exhausted. He swung a fist that would have shattered her jaw, but Emily didn't block. She dropped. She slid under the hook, using the slick floor to pivot behind him. She grabbed a plastic IV pole, MRI safe, and swung it with both hands, driving it into the back of his knee. It shattered on impact, but it buckled his leg. Vargas grunted, stumbling, but his momentum carried him into a spin. He backhanded her, a heavy, clumsy blow that caught her on the shoulder. Emily flew backward, crashing into the crash cart. Oxygen tubing and gauze pads rained down on her. Her vision blurred. Pain flared hot in her shoulder, but her mind was cold. Target is disoriented. Center of gravity is high. Vargas was on her before she could stand. He grabbed her throat, his thumbs digging into her windpipe, lifting her off the floor. His eyes were wide, manic. "I'm going to snap your neck." Emily couldn't breathe. Black spots danced in her vision. She clawed at his face, but his grip was iron. Her feet kicked uselessly at the air. Her hand flailed blindly behind her, searching the crash cart she was pinned against. Her fingers brushed cold plastic. Handles, wires. The defibrillator. It was a Zoll unit, battery-operated. She gripped the handles. Her thumb found the charge button. A high-pitched whine rose, cutting through the mechanical thrum of the MRI. Vargas heard it. He looked down, confused by the sound rising from the woman he was strangling. "Clear," Emily wheezed.
She jammed the paddles into his ribs, one on each side of his torso. She triggered the discharge. 200 joules of raw electricity slammed into Vargas's chest. His body went rigid. The electrical impulse overrode every message his brain was sending to his muscles. His grip on her throat shattered instantly. He was thrown back, his back arching, a guttural sound tearing from his throat that wasn't human. He collapsed to the floor, convulsing, his heart rhythm thrown into chaos. Emily fell with him, gasping for air, clutching her bruised throat. She scrambled backward, away from the twitching giant. She grabbed the wall to pull herself up. Her legs were shaking. The room was spinning. The pile of rifles stuck to the MRI machine groaned as the magnetic field shifted, the metal straining against the plastic. She looked at Vargas. He wasn't moving. She looked at the VIP, Castillo, who was staring at her from the floor with terrified awe. Vital signs, Emily rasped, her voice a wreck. Unstable. She walked over to Vargas, not to handcuff him, but to check his pulse. She was a nurse first. But as she knelt beside him, the silence of the room was broken by a sound that made her blood freeze. The red quench light on the console overhead began to flash. The machine wasn't just spinning up anymore. The impact of the rifles had cracked the cryostat. The liquid helium that kept the magnet cool was boiling off. A plume of white freezing vapor began to vent from the top of the machine, filling the ceiling with a rapidly expanding cloud. The pressure was building. If the emergency vent failed, the helium would displace all the oxygen in the room in under 30 seconds. Emily lunged for the door handle, but it wouldn't turn. The impact of the fight had jammed the latch. They were locked in a room that was rapidly becoming a gas chamber. And down the hall she could hear the heavy, muffled thud of a SWAT battering ram hitting the wrong door.
The door didn't open. It disintegrated. A shower of sparks cascaded onto the linoleum as the SWAT team's circular saw chewed through the deadbolt. A split second later, a battering ram slammed into the frame with a concussive boom that shook the walls. The door swung inward, twisted and broken, and the hallway air rushed in to mix with the escaping white fog of boiling helium. "Breaching! Breaching! Go, go, go!" The room was instantly flooded with tactical lights and the heavy, aggressive stomp of armored boots. A dozen SWAT operators poured into the MRI suite, rifles raised, shouting commands that overlapped into a wall of noise. "Police! Hands! Show me hands! Left side clear! Contact front! Get on the ground!" They moved with the frantic energy of men expecting a firefight. They expected to walk into a kill zone to trade fire with a cartel hit squad. But as the beams of their weapon lights cut through the thinning vapor, the shouting faltered. Then it stopped altogether. The lead breacher lowered his rifle, his finger hovering off the trigger. "Central?" he said into his headset, his voice thick with confusion. "You're not going to believe this." The room was a graveyard of good intentions and bad decisions. The MRI machine was silent now, the quench complete, but it still looked like a modern art masterpiece of violence. A twisted sculpture of assault rifles, knives, and tactical vests was jammed into the scanner's bore, held there by the residual magnetic grip and the force of the impact. Below the machine, the mercenary who had been pinned was now slumped on the floor. He wasn't dead, but he was incapacitated, his wrists and ankles bound tight, not with handcuffs, but with clear plastic IV tubing, knotted with a complexity that would require surgical scissors to remove. Near the door, the two men from the chemical trap in the closet were huddled together, weeping softly, their eyes bandaged with wet gauze. And in the center of the room, near the patient table, lay Commander Vargas. The terrifying tactical leader was unconscious, breathing rhythmically. Kneeling beside him was Emily. She didn't look up as the SWAT team surrounded her. She was calm, her movements precise. She had ripped open a sterile packaging kit and was applying a pressure dressing to a laceration on Vargas's forehead where he had hit the floor. "Ma'am, step away from the suspect," an officer shouted, leveling his weapon. Emily finished taping the gauze. She checked the pulse in Vargas's neck. Strong, regular. Satisfied, she wiped her hands on her scrub pants, stood up slowly, and turned to face the wall of black uniforms. She looked small. Her ponytail was coming loose, strands of blonde hair framing a face smudged with soot and sweat. Her blue scrubs were stained with chemical splashes and blood that wasn't hers. She looked exhausted. She looked like a nurse who had just finished a double shift from hell. The SWAT captain pushed through the line. He looked at the unconscious cartel leader, then at the tangled rifles in the machine, and finally at the woman standing in the middle of it all with a bruised throat and a clipboard. He lowered his mask. "Nurse?" he asked, incredulous. "What happened here? Where is the squad?" Emily gestured vaguely to the heap of unconscious men.
Triage is complete, she said, her voice raspy but steady. Patient in 404 is shaken but stable. These men, they need to be transported to the prison ward. They have chemical burns, blunt force trauma, and one likely cardiac arrhythmia. The captain blinked. You did this? He looked at Vargas, a man wanted by 3 federal agencies, currently napping with a neat bandage on his head. How? These are paramilitary contractors. How did you take them down? The rest of the hospital staff had begun to gather in the hallway behind the police line. Dr. Evans was there, peering over a policeman's shoulder, his mouth hanging open. Sarah was clutching her phone, filming. They were looking at Emily like they had never seen her before. They saw the blood. They saw the wreckage. They saw the Ice Queen standing in the ashes of a war zone. Emily picked up her battered blue bag from the floor. She slung it over her shoulder, feeling the familiar, comforting weight of the kit. She adjusted her ponytail, pulling it tight, pulling the mask back into place. She looked the captain in the eye, her expression flat, unreadable. They slipped, she said. She didn't wait for a follow-up question. She stepped around the armored officer, avoiding the shattered glass on the floor. "Excuse me," she murmured to a stunned SWAT operator who was blocking the door. "I have rounds to finish. Mr. Henderson in room 402 still needs his kidney meds." The sea of black uniforms parted for her. Emily walked out of the MRI suite and into the corridor. She moved with that same silent, shuffling gait, shoulders hunched, head down, the boring nurse once again. But as she turned the corner towards the nurse's station, away from the chaos and the cameras, she reached into her pocket. Her fingers brushed against a small, black object she had taken from Vargas's vest before the police arrived. A crypto-encrypted flash drive. She didn't know what was on it, but she knew Vargas hadn't come for a patient. He had come for this, and now she had it. Emily smiled, a ghost of an expression that vanished as quickly as it appeared. The night shift was over, but she had a feeling her work was just getting started. You just got a full Hollywood-level thriller experience completely for free. No ticket price, no expensive popcorn. The only admission fee I'm asking for is a like and a subscribe. If you watch this whole story and leave without clicking that button, you're basically dining and dashing. Don't be that person. Pay for your seat. Hit the button.